The biblical account leads us to believe that Adam and Eve were the first people, and many readers will imagine that this also means that they were the only people. Yet if we look at the early stories of Genesis, you might be confused to find not only other families, but entire cities that manifest as if from nowhere. Could it be possible that God populated the earth with more people than we're led to believe? One theory suggests that an entire race of unfinished humans were wandering the earth, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. In this video, I want to explore all the characters believed to be living alongside Adam and Eve from Jewish folklore, some of which prove to be truly menacing. Where did they come from, and what can they reveal about the early days of the earth? The first few chapters of Genesis are pretty consistent in that Adam and Eve are undoubtedly the first humans created by the biblical God. These are the first and only humans to inhabit the Garden of Eden, and they're also the first and only humans to inherit the rest of the earth. Now, we don't know exactly how long Adam and Eve lived outside of Eden before giving birth to Cain, but we know it had to have been at least around 9 months, whereby the population of the earth became 3. Again, we don't know exactly what the age gap was between Cain and Abel, as the Bible doesn't specify this. But we do know that Abel was the second-born, and thus the 4th member of the earth. This is all neatly laid out for us, and for the most part, readers won't have any questions regarding exactly who was there in the early days of the earth. However, by the end of Genesis 4, after Cain kills Abel, our understanding of the earth's population is completely thrown on its head. You see, when Cain kills Abel and is punished to wander the earth, he tells God, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." The biggest question on most readers' lips here is who? Who is Cain so afraid of when, as far as the Bible is concerned, the only other people in existence were his parents? I've heard one idea seek to explain this away by suggesting that whilst we know Cain would have been the only other wanderer on the earth, Cain didn't know that, and so naturally assumed that there were others out there who, for whatever reason, were in the mind to kill him if they crossed paths. However, this can be contested because God does take Cain's concerns seriously and does proceed to mark him so that anyone who did come across him would know not to harm him. You could say that this was God merely giving Cain peace of mind, that no harm would come to him whilst he was wandering. But the simplest answer is that there were other people on the earth at that time, people the Bible doesn't deem noteworthy enough to explain. One idea is that these people whom Cain fears are lesser men, perhaps those of whom were Neanderthal-esque. It might sound like an evolutionist angle, but it would serve to incorporate the various subspecies of man, and thus the theory of evolution, thereby merging the religious account with a more scientific one. Of course, this is not a widely accepted claim at all, but again, it would explain why Cain was so fearful, and yet why the Bible never describes these people as such, for they were much more savage and perhaps more prone to violence. Now, this idea does pretty much fall apart almost immediately after Cain does end up wandering, because no sooner does he leave the presence of God does he suddenly take up a wife. The Bible doesn't deem it necessary to tell us much at all, except that Cain made love to her and she became pregnant, and thus bore him a son named Enoch. Now, you might say that Cain's wife could have been a Neanderthal herself, and that maybe when Cain went wandering, he found these sub-people to be less abrasive than he had originally assumed. Cain's wife becomes the first person mentioned in the Bible who doesn't seem to have come from Adam and Eve, and yet the way the Bible casually drops her into the conversation by telling us that Cain made love to her makes it seem as if her presence isn't at all significant. We know from the passage that Cain went out to live in the land of Nod after he was banished, but we aren't told whether he had taken this wife of his from his home in Adam's vicinity, or whether he had found her at Nod. Both scenarios are problematic. If she was already within the vicinity of Adam, it leads us to believe that she was likely then a daughter of Adam and Eve. Remember, we don't exactly know the ages of Cain and Abel when the murder took place, and so realistically, going by biblical ages, Cain could have been well over 100 years old. In fact, the Bible specifically tells us in Adam's genealogy that Adam was 130 years old when he had Seth. So could it be possible that Adam and Eve had hundreds of other children within that time frame that the Bible just didn't mention? You'll notice that when Seth is born, he is described as being in the likeness of Adam, suggesting that he was righteous and something of a remarkable baby. This then leads some to believe that there were other children being born between Abel and Seth, but that the Bible never mentioned any of them because none of them were particularly noteworthy. If that's to be believed, then there were probably a multitude of daughters born that were eligible to marry Cain. On the other hand, if Cain did meet his wife at the land of Nod, then who was she and how did she get there? Since the Bible does not specifically identify the name nor origin of Cain's wife, many commentators have come to one of the more plausible explanations within the confines of the biblical narrative, that this woman was his sister, his niece, or perhaps a great-niece. It's important to remember that whilst biblical art frames Cain and Abel in their 20s or 30s, we don't actually know how old they were when the infamous siblicide took place. Yet again, the Genesis account leaves another detail unanswered, and because we know these characters lived well into their 800s or 900s, Cain could have killed Abel hundreds of years after having known him. If this was the case, then we know that in these hundreds of years that transpired, Adam and Eve would have given birth to more children. One of their prime directives by God was to populate the earth after all. From these hundreds, maybe even thousands of children who in turn had time to age into fully grown adults and perhaps have children of their own, Cain would have more than a few options to fill the role of his wife. Indeed, this would in fact be his sister or his niece, depending on who the lucky lady was. Whilst not specified in the Quran, which follows mostly the same rhetoric as the biblical account, an Islamic tradition, spawned from various hadiths, proposes that the children of Adam and Eve were born with an accompanying twin sister. In this case, Cain was born with a twin sister named Aklima, who would become Adam and Eve's first daughter, whilst Abel was born with a twin sister named Azura. Whilst this idea isn't traditionally canon in any of the major religions, it does allow for a neater explanation as to where Cain might have acquired a wife. In one of these non-canonical traditions, Adam instructed Cain to marry Abel's twin sister Azura, and for Abel to marry Cain's twin sister Aklima. However, Cain resented this arrangement and told Adam that they should let God decide by means of a sacrifice. Adam consented, and when Cain's sacrifice was rejected, it was taken to mean that God disapproved of Cain's marriage to his own twin Aklima, and that she was to be married to Abel as Adam intended. So overcome by jealousy that Abel got to be with the woman he wanted, Cain killed Abel and then fled with Aklima to the land of Nod. It's worth noting here that again, the Bible never specifically mentions people living at Nod, and that Nod was merely a Hebrew term for wandering. In this instance, the land of wandering, a place exclusively then made for Cain that was east of Eden. This then leads many theologians to conclude that Cain's wife was likely a daughter of Adam and Eve, who had gone into exile with Cain when he was made to leave their presence. However, this doesn't explain why Cain would go on to build a city there. Indeed, if it's just him, his wife, and his son Enoch, then why would they need a whole city? This development has since led many to believe that there were people at Nod, or that perhaps others had followed Cain's example and had become wanderers themselves. Realizing this, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Cain then took it upon himself to build the city, a city he is said to name after his son, as sort of a sanctuary for all the lost wandering souls. A simpler theory puts forth that in the 100 or so years that passed by after Abel's death, Adam and Eve's many other unnamed sons and daughters might have migrated to the surrounding regions, and perhaps even Nod. These then might also become the same people who Cain may have been so afraid of, those who would come to resent Cain for having killed their brother Abel too. Another idea posits that if Nod did have a settlement of people, then these were likely sinners, other descendants of Adam who had either been exiled for their own transgressions, or those who believed they didn't need God, and thus went out of his presence. Remember, it's plausible that over 100 years had passed since the murder of Abel, and thus it may very well have been over 100 years since God communicated with anyone. The last time we see God talk to anyone of Adam's immediate family was when he was banishing Cain, and so it has been theorized that God was so upset with what had transpired that he ceased communication with man. With such potential silence, it is no wonder that people began to roam and remove themselves from God's presence, for they were never given a chance to know him, and so didn't believe him. Going back to that Neanderthal theory, I did come upon an idea that Cain had built the city of Enoch for these very subhumans, and that because these were godless people, he effectively became just like them, albeit smarter. Therefore, could it be the case that Cain became the ruler of these now extinct species, and perhaps even civilized them, at least enough that they had established their own habitat behind stone walls and cultivated a loose sense of society? Many will scoff at this notion. After all, the Bible never mentions such a subspecies of man ever existing, and I know many devout are keen to dismiss the idea of evolution. However, ancient Jewish folklore does point out various stories of God creating drafts of humans, and that whilst Adam was the perfect human, he wasn't exactly the prototype. According to author Howard Schwartz, in his work The Tree of Souls, Adam wasn't the first man, but rather God had created something far more disturbing. Schwartz notes that there is little record remaining of such creatures, but that there were early attempts at humanity by God that, after having been formed and allowed to roam the earth, were destroyed and made extinct. These creatures were called Adne Sadeh, creatures that, whilst resembled man, had some key, rather unusual differences. One of the main characteristics of the Adne Sadeh was that they were made with a cord attached to their navels that then also connected them to the earth. The cord was said to grow up to more than the length of a mile, allowing the being to traverse longer distances in search of sustenance, but nevertheless they were still limited by the reach of the cord. In fact, Schwartz tells us that if the cord was cut, then the Adne Sadeh would immediately die. Indeed, the creature depended on the cord remaining attached to the earth, and whilst it didn't seem to feed off the earth via the cord, considering it is noted that it would search for fruits and vegetables within its allowed radius, the attachment was still seen to be necessary. The account here also notes that occasionally it would lure animals that wandered too close to it, and that so long as the animals did not flee out of its limited reach, it would catch them and eat them. The lifespan of the Adne Sadeh is also described as being very long, perhaps even longer than what the average human could expect. Although considering biblical ages in the times before the flood, this might make narrative sense for an early human. Schwartz hints at the versatility and formidability of the Adne Sadeh, remarking that short of the flood, or other disasters, there was little that could take the early human's life, unless its cord was snapped. Naturally, the Bible never mentions anything of the sort, but quite like the Nephilim described in chapter 6 of Genesis, there is an idea, also confirmed by Schwartz, that the Adne Sadeh would have perished during the events of the biblical flood. Indeed, even if these creatures could swim, they could only swim as far as their individual cords would allow. While Schwartz provides the term Adne Sadeh to describe this primitive man, a modern scholarly commentary of the Mishnat Eretz Yisrael to be specific, describes these beings as Adne Sadeh, men of the field, or simply wild men, whom the ancients believed were inhabiting the land at some point, perhaps even coinciding with the times of Adam and Eve, and again, perhaps the very same men that Cain might have feared when he was being punished to wander the wilderness. According to various pre-Adamite theories, many of which are discussed in the works of political scientist Michael Barkan, a 19th century attitude saw the rise of a racist idea that when Cain had been banished, he took up residence with non-white Mongols who were inhabiting the earth, and that it was from these inferior people that he took a wife. Such an idea was popular amongst white supremacists of the day, who would propose that this was an adequate means to explain the ancestry of non-whites, who because of their starkly different features from their own, couldn't have shared the same lineage as them. Birkin tells us in his work Religion and the Racist Right that the theory was attractive to certain religious writers because it served to explain exegetical problems, such as where Cain's wife came from, who the city of Enoch was built for, as well as why whites were inherently better than non-whites, for they were descended from Adam. Mid-19th century clergyman Buckner H. Payne published a pamphlet in 1867 titled The Negro, What is His Ethnological Status?, where he insisted that if the flood had been a global event, then the only people who ought to have survived were white people, because they were the ones without sin. Therefore, it made no sense to him why there were different nationalities still living in the modern day. In order to explain this, he proposed that non-whites, which he described as humans of the field, were taken aboard the ark in the same manner as the animals in order to preserve them. These he determines were pre-Adamites, in that they were made along with the animals and thus before man, and that because they were a separate species, they didn't have immortal souls like Adam would, and therefore were ineligible to enter paradise. In another late 19th century book titled The Pre-Ademite by writer A. Lester Hoyle, it is claimed that there were 5 distinct races that were created by God, but that only the 5th race, the white race of which Adam was the father, had been made in God's own image and likeness. Therefore, the 4 other races that existed prior to Adam's creation were either basically prototypes or failed experiments that now permeated the earth. By this logic, Hoyle would argue that there were people living before the creation of Adam and Eve, but that they weren't white people, and thus would have been lesser. Furthermore, Hoyle adds that Cain was the mongrel offspring of an affair between Eve and an enticing Mongolian, whom she had repeated trysts with. Such an idea as this would help serve the foundation for the white supremacist belief that interracial marriages were an abomination, for they could only produce murderous, violent people like Cain. According to an idea put forth by 19th century preacher Conrad Gard, Cain likely married a pre-Adamite woman, which coincided with the beliefs of A. Lester Hoyle, that these descendants were a mongrel hybrid race. According to these blatantly racist ideas then, these appear to be the very people that Cain was so fearful of, though ironically, they also appear to be the very people he ends up mating with, and perhaps, as aforementioned, ended up building a city for. Biblical scholar Gleason Archer Jr. attempted to reconcile the likes of Neanderthal Man, dating back to 38,000 BC, with the traditional account presented in the Bible. Obviously, Genesis makes no reference to the older human species, and with that, Archer aimed to present these beings as existing before Adam's time, and thus were not included in the divine covenant. Indeed, God had created them by this logic, but he had not bestowed on them any sort of holy bond that we know of. Archer would argue that only Adam and his descendants, black or white, were infused with the breath of God and possessed a spiritual nature corresponding to God himself, but the likes of Neanderthal Man existed with as much significance as any other land mammal. This then becomes another neat way to explain just who Cain was afraid of, who his wife may have been, and whom he was building the city of Enoch for. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.